Great to be here, everyone. I'll kick off with just some key influences. Obviously, in half an hour, it's really hard to sort of summate all of your influences in your lives over the past 20 years. So I've focused on probably the biggest influencer, who's Carlo Scarpa. He's Italian, a Venetian architect, mostly because his work straddles between the clever understanding of landscape, architecture and interiors all at once. So he's able to sort of move between the sort of the big vision and then bringing things down to very, very fine detail. There's a chapel at Brion. It's in Castelfranco Veneto. These are some of his drawings. So again, this sort of plan, section, perspectival, at once relationship of the drawing. And I guess I grew up in this era of the hand drawing and the physical model and trying to understand things orthographically and trying to actually break down space in that particular way. His attention to detail, this is some of the work he's done in Venice. This is I've just had a mental blank, Verona, the Castle Vecchio in Verona. Again, for his masterful understanding of interior design and the relationship of old and new, and how he just builds moments into interior spaces. Interesting story where he actually revealed the old covered history from previous architects for the Castle Vecchio. So there are all these moments in the project that build depth and timeless depth into the project. And again, his influences through the Japanese and through his travels. The old and the new, I think the sort of dialogue of sort of great history that comes with Italy, but also what a new and contemporary layer can be. And not just Carlos Scarpa, but the contemporary Spanish, all the contemporary architects that, modernism, started with modernism, but obviously is well and truly not dead. This is a great example of his houses and how, again, this sort of blending of garden and landscape, interior and exterior. I guess the next phase of my influences as I've become, I guess, older and as a more seasoned architect is really the makers of our projects. This is Boris. He's a joiner, really passionate joiner. And I think this really captures the sort of essence of projects. And a new project we're working on at the moment, it's a relatively small project, but the branding which Frost has actually been involved with has been really about the making of the project, as opposed to, the naked girl on the cover, and you can see, the rollout that's going on, especially in the residential market at the moment. It's just this constant kind of rollout mentality, whereas this was all about the making and the curating of the project itself. So there's an authenticity about this that I really liked, and Vince and the team just said, just capture the authenticity. Passion for furniture and bringing that detail down, and then how that might start to translate into the interior of a project. So again, very passionate about interior, even though I'm mostly an architect and spend most of my time in large-scale projects. Coming down to a much finer scale, dabbling in a bit of furniture design. This is a conventional table that basically unscrews. There's no mechanical parts. It's a threaded, solid timber, and it's called screwed, and it comes flat packed and assembles. This is again a sort of furniture piece. So just this sort of straddling from the large scale to the very fine scale has always been interesting for me, no matter what the project is. A lot of you may know about parametric design and architecture. This is a fantastic artist that I'm quite fond of. This is actually a 70s piece that he's put together. He's a Croatian artist, and it's all handmade, but it's actually parametric. It's the start of parametric design, done in the mid-1970s. So amazing panels, and a lot of this is what's coming through in the computer world. And again, just more abstract concepts around art, and this idea of abstraction really fascinates me. And again, I look for abstraction in my work all the time. I honed a lot of my early skills as an architect in houses. I still do them. I love doing house design, very passionate about it. There's always that strong relationship with the owner. This is actually one of Vince's counterparts, Stephen Cornwell's house. So we've worked on a lot of these for either friends or clients, another one in lawn. So again, you know, the sort of dialogue and the composition of the site and the embedding of site and its relationship to context, you know, the importance of placemaking, no matter what the scale of the project, really getting that understanding and the relationship of view. Another early house, this is far north Queensland. So again, this is sort of sequence of trying to find the essence of projects. And I think with small residential projects, you're able to sort of look for small narratives that can build up. And if you rescale those narratives, they apply to the large commercial scale. Obviously interior design, this is a good example of sort of North Shore project where again the joinery starts to play a really important part of what the concept of the architecture and what it means to live within the space. A more recent project in Queenstown, New Zealand, a little cottage. And again, this implicates a sort of design of a studio apartment, say in the city, even though it's a luxury cottage out of Queenstown. And the attention to detail and the interest in the detail and again working with the sort of makers. To sort of shift the scale, this is a recent NAB building in the Docklands in Melbourne. It's an immense project. We're both the architect and interior architect. These large complex projects build their narratives and build their scale and the momentum over a very long period of time. And I guess for us, we've been really focusing on design strategies that really simplify to the reader, to the client, to the authorities, a process around design that starts with a very simple analysis. You know, we're convinced that within one A3 you could tell any narrative for any building. So this is a really simple one around the NAB. It sits in a really awkward context. You can see how it's literally wedged in amongst the stadium and adjacent architecture. It's on the western end of the city, and NAB really wanted this idea of spatial ambiguity to become the concept for the bank. They didn't want a traditional reading of what a bank meant, this idea of a sort of pervasive facade. So we developed a kind of, and again, we work with a variety of people to develop this sort of concept around ambiguity and what that meant, history, memory, what it meant in terms of community within the building itself. And we test very early. I mean, for me, the sort of hand scribble, the early fleeting sketch, we go back, actually the idea was embedded in the first hour of the first session. And we've done, you know, maybe 6 weeks of testing, and we've come back to what actually was the first idea. So it's quite fascinating with this project. It literally was the first idea that retained. But I guess these guys are big influences for me. The younger generation and how they're working with us to sort of test different architectural conditions, both physically and then in terms of the computer. I mean, I'm relatively illiterate on a computer, but my relationship with my team and the people who manipulate Rhino and Max and Revit and all of the software is very important. And any large-scale design team, the genesis of the projects find their way in this kind of continual dialogue. So NAB, the sort of urban personalities of the project, the sort of the variety, the bookending of a triangular site. So there were 3 different personalities in terms of entry and a protective corner, and one that dealt with the stadium address. And then this idea of the Fisher community and how that fed through into the interior. So again, this idea of ambiguity, but creating the sort of hubs within the interior and an atria and creating a legibility in the skin. I guess for us, is this constant presentation process back to the client and communication process is key. So I think we work really hard on computer narratives in the software to sort of build the complexity of the diagram. And I think it's key, and it's very telling when you see poor architecture or a poor process where the diagram isn't apparent. And I think it's something that we're always looking for and always trying to either simplify or refine, whatever the case may be. So this is a sort of example of now how the graphs feed into the facade of the building and how they tie up onto the kite roof concept. So this is the Fisher brought through more in 3D. So this is an early model. And this is a later model that's been unravelled in the design development process. So we're actually flattening out and then rationalising the facade types. So again, a very simple narrative to explain, I guess, how that architecture unfolds. And this is a DNC delivery, so it's not that slow, it's very quick. So we're running both concurrent conceptual teams with a technical team. So it's a huge challenge to be managing the delivery of projects that way. And for us, I think it's pertinent to any great scale project that if you don't have your technical team leading the production outcome for the builders, you know, you're in trouble. So you need those experienced hands at the table. So these are just some of the finished examples of those fissures and what they look like. They're quite transformative. Another example is Vineyard Walk. It's another current project. It's under construction. We won this by competition. It was based around this sort of concept of flow that we established with transport and the city. Vineyard Walk, for those of you who don't know, it's basically a series of infrastructural projects that connect the 20,000 people per hour heading to the new Barangaroo development. So it's connecting the city to Barangaroo. Enormous scale in terms of the volume of people. Clarence Building is an entry portal building, so it's literally a building for pedestrians to feed into. There's a tunnel, and then there's a plaza and a bridge that connects the lower side of Barangaroo. And again, looking for the sort of hook, for us, it was a series of very disparate connected pieces of infrastructure across the city. So we just said, well, surely the idea of flow would be a way of connecting all those disparate pieces. And it starts off with a very crude diagram and analysis, but the crude diagram has maintained its clarity through the project. So it tied all the pieces together. So sometimes the narrative is actually about a cladding idea, or it might be a pedestrian movement idea. You can see here some examples of the studies of the sketches that are used to describe that narrative, and how that feeds into also an interior language. So we developed a whole series of flow cladding transitions to start to deal with all the different junctions. Then the analysis of that cladding in terms of the rhino modelling and the scripting all atypical components, and the translation of those components into Revit, which is the documentation software. So I think, you know, this is always going back and forth. It's not a linear process. It's a much more circular process that we're encouraging to sort of build depth and clarity into the resolution of design intent. These are some of the flow cladding elevations. Again, more of those transitions, and then the communication again to enable people, multiple teams. We work across multiple studios. We're a global practice. So New York studio work very closely with us. They have a lot of facade expertise. So we share the model overnight, and we have VCs to deal with the discussions around the resolution. This is an example of lighting. Just an image of how that portal starts to feed into the space, and then this is the underground. These are the early drawings that explain the tunnel and the language around the tunnel. And they've remained very true to the project. This is our working design model. So again, you're just sort of solving these there's a big elbow in the tunnel by virtue of the predicated plan that's been given to us. So our working model that's been shared is starting to break down the scale and actually dealing with a lot of the variety of interfaces and the clash detection, but not in a sense of buildability, in a design sense. So this is from our Rhino working model, and just trying to really work through the analysis of this project. We co-located all the media screens, and we made them a real commodity in this project. So it's something that they're now fighting for in terms of the value, because, you know, imagine iPhone, you know, being promoted down with 20,000 people going past per hour. It's a really valuable tool, and this is the prototype of that tunnel. And again, I won't get into the detail of it, but just the idea of shifting from the idea to the one-to-one. So something, again, we're really encouraging with all of our work, that the one-to-one ultimately is the ultimate test of the spatial resolution within any project. whether it be interior or you know, a knuckle or components of facade. The Ivy is a project that was 6 years perhaps in the making, from when we met the client, Justin and the Merivale family. Fascinating client, amazing project. We met Justin, he took us to the site. This was the photo I took for the first half hour since meeting him. Sydney used to have Melbourne lanes, and Ash Street was one of them, and Hunter Connection, and a whole variety of poor decision making, probably in the 70s and 80s, eradicated most of the lanes in Sydney. So this was something that obviously we had to deal with. The large urban scale issues around lane connectivity, but of course the client brief. And the client brief was really about this kind of whimsical place. It was a house. It was probably one of the biggest houses I've worked on in the city, 20,000 square metres. But the sort of narratives that the client was building with his branding consultants, some of your counterparts, was fantastic, because they were bringing this whole anticipation around a project that hadn't even been built. And a lot of this was not choreographed, it wasn't propped, it was actually real. This is real photography in the family home. The models were imported though. So it's fascinating. This started to sort of allude to what was to come of the Ivy. And so this is this most amazing mind, the Merivale family and Justin. What was great for us as a business, we're a large global practice. He understood we could deliver, but he also understood that we had the sort of intimacy of work capability to deliver the house in the city. So we ended up, you know, winning. We built a whole inspirational strategy around the mid-century homes, which is a key part of the brief. This was a house in the city. It was actually a lot bigger in scale than he had ever originally anticipated. Paley Park in New York City was the first notion that was presented back to the city. And this was to explain the idea that this was to be a reprieve in the city, like Paley Park has been built around over the years in New York, but it was this amazing reprieve. I know it's abstract as a concept, but the sort of the greening and the gardening that was to come into this project was unseen in Sydney. And of course the mid-century masters, we examined a lot of their work, Paul Rudolph, John Lautner, Wright, mostly Rudolph's work, for their clarity of expression and their sort of timelessness, and again for the relationship of architecture to landscape. And some of the particular projects which started to influence more were the Bass Residence, again 70s project, but for the multi-layering and the split-level design, you know, the idea of the sort of cross-transparency across living spaces and pool decks. And then there was the Milan residence, which again started to sort of talk about this idea of the street wall for us, because we had a very low-scale project that had to be built up in Sydney's George Street. Again, really difficult to do. The city requires a 40-plus square metre street frontage. It's next to some of the most historic buildings in the city. Societe Generale is probably one of the most protected heritage buildings in the city. So it was about trying to understand what this language could be and couldn't be. Some more work of Rudolph's in New York, and again, this really paralleled what we were doing in the city, because this was very controversial in New York at the time. You know, couldn't build above a brownstone, you couldn't possibly have a roof garden, engaging old and new. So we saw some really interesting parallels. It was an enormous collaboration project. I won't talk about the interiors, but we worked with Hector Guthrie, or Hector Phelan Guthrie at the time. We worked with Stephen Cornwell, Daniel Baskey, 360 Degrees. And from the outset, it was all about this collaborative effort to develop this typology. 18 bars, 9 restaurants, a ballroom, the largest ballroom in Sydney, 2 penthouses, 20-odd thousand square metres of mixed-use hospitality environments. And you can rent an intimate space, or you can rent the entire venue. And I think the commercial model behind the way Merivale think is extraordinary, and that's one of the secrets, that it's completely flexible to hire for, you know, a birthday or a massive corporate function. This was the typology that Justin was very familiar with, that he wanted to bring to the project, and it was a rooftop typology. So there was a series of typologies that found their way into the project. This is very, very typical Miami, Los Angeles. We have the climate in Sydney, but we're mostly indoors, which is quite unusual. Even as the Merivale family, being a pub owner, to be having most of their venues indoors is quite extraordinary. So this was all about the outdoor. But also, there was this film which was always referred to, and if you were to take the value proposition of the project, it was Peter Sellers' The Party. You know, it was a bit of a piss take. It was fun. It's not meant to be serious. And you know, this really summarises Merivale and probably the whole process, the 6 years that we spent developing a relationship with the client. And it really captures his spirit and what the project was actually about for him, and for how it needed to convey to the customer. Then there's a serious side, I guess. Then so you know, getting this through the city and executing the project. So the genesis of Ivy, house in the city, completely built around, you know, we started with the really simple sketches, and Nick and I were, well, what is this thing, and how do we bring it together? We actually relocated the lane in order to activate Ash Street completely, and it was a big move to open up the urban precinct and completely activate it, and we put all the entry points back in the lane. So it was a kind of big urban shift to create that whole re-pedestrianisation. And again, I'll only show a narrative around the facades because we don't have the time, but this is a sort of start of some of that. And I dug up some early sketches. Sorry about the quality, but I think it was important to see the sort of correlation between the early thinking. You know, side elevations are actually really hidden. You know, when you've got a 1.5 metre lane, you can't actually see that elevation, but the amount of effort, you know, we went through to track all of the facade conditions, and then obviously bring a clarity to the usability of this open street wall, this open grid. So these are some of those studies, and we presented these to the city. I don't think the city at the time really understood what it was getting, but we got through it. Some sectional studies as well, elevation and section. So just this build-up of the grid, very important. And the model study which shows. So the lane used to run through here, we relocated it. You can see the build-up of the street wall. We took critical datums from historic, but mostly it was about permeability and this sort of facade that really juxtaposes between its adjacent relationships and creates indoor-outdoor environments that really speak to the nature of what's behind bar, outdoor space, indoor courtyard space. There was also a heritage component. The lane was a readaptation. We demolished the former NAB building, so there was an expression of the history through the patination and reuse of brick and reuse of the stone lintels and re-embedding that material into the new fabric. And that's a view of the rear lane. That's the nexus of Ash Street and Palings, the new Palings lane, so the sort of completely activated lane precinct, the sunken courtyard. And then the last component that formed the project was the pool and the rooftop pool. It's the 5th elevation. People look down onto it. Of course, it's all about being occupiable, so there's this sort of intense occupiable spaces, and you know, we fussed over the height of water and how it would suit male, female, and how you could get up onto a stage, or how it would transform into a concert. Enormous thought. I mean, it had all been in his head for years, and we just, I guess, unravelled it through a process of working with him. So really fascinating, and again, a really short summation of the Ivy. But I think, you know, for us, it was definitely a key to a transformative project in our business, because I guess it's a microcosm of some of the projects we're doing around the world. I mean, it's a complex mixed-use project. We've exported it all over the world in a variety of forms. It may sit underneath a residential tower or commercial environment, or commercial retail residential environment for some of the work we're doing in China and a variety of places. So it's an amazing project, had a long genesis. and we've maintained a really good relationship, and I think it's still very commercially viable and ongoing, and I think that this part of the success has been in the sort of the complexity around the space and the offerings. It also won the Lloyd Rees Medal for Urban Design, which again we weren't expecting, but to win an urban award for a commercial project of that nature was pretty exciting. I'm doing reasonably well, 25 minutes. So I thought there were just a couple of shorter narratives around some projects. I thought I'd finish on my home, my personal home. It won the World Architecture Festival Award back in 2011, which is, for me, obviously a massive achievement. But I think more so, it was one that I probably had the most fear of because we submitted, it got shortlisted, but I didn't really have a narrative to give to the WAF, or not that I knew of. And I always said, well, what am I going to tell them? Because, Marcia Kogan, John Wardell, Issy Weinfeld, all these amazing residential architects from all over the world, Fearon Hay from New Zealand, an extraordinary shortlist, and to be up against these guys. So again, I just concentrated on, I guess, what was my story. So I guess there's a little bit of everything packed into this project. We were working with precasters at the time with the Ivy, so there's a sort of relationship with the builders, and I guess more a relationship of the reality of what it means to buy land in Australia and to develop something in personal regard and affordability of that land. So the Australian dream, my parents, mum and dad, they came here in the 70s. They bought their quarter acre in suburban Kidman Park in Adelaide, it's near the beaches, western suburbs. But for them, it was about access to land and having a bit of outdoor space. And the Aussie backyard was that back in the day, and I had to forego that for my dad's tomatoes, but that's okay. We still had some space, and they were happy with that. And the homes were relatively modest and well sized for their block size. But I think what's happened in Australia over the past few years is we've actually surpassed the States, and we've become the largest average dwelling size in the world. Like, to have beaten America is quite extraordinary. So the new suburbia, the biggest house on the smallest block for the lowest price. And if you actually break down the analysis of the brief, triple garages, 270 square metre average, 3 bathrooms, 5 bathrooms for a family of 3 to 4. So the family's been shrinking, but you need more bathrooms, rumpus room, sitting room, living room, tiny backyard, no trees, and then the commute. It's all about excess. And I think this was the thing that I presented to the world stage, that was, we were following every other country and every other city in the world, and we still are. I think we're getting a little bit smarter, but we define McMansion, everyone talks about it. Well, that's a definition of it, but I mean, it has its validity because it's providing affordable housing. There has to be a converse solution. And that's a little bit of what that suburbia is looking like when it's poorly, I guess, designed, and the relationship of the outdoor to indoor, and even worse, this is a real image of some of our outer suburban areas, the sort of layering of the tiled roofs. It's just excess on excess, and coupled with that, I remember someone was telling me that their car park expenses to park in the city and commute. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's worth more than the car. Not that I'm discouraging living in the suburbs, but it was just, this is a model of affordability in Australia. So then the converse model is inner city suburb, Surrey Hills. I mean, that's where the block had been purchased, and I just tried to explain, what values were, because they didn't really understand, I guess, to make it relevant. So 1-bedroom apartment, 650,000, 2-bedroom, 850, both with cars. Turner and Associates project, fantastic building. That's the sort of the benchmark. And so for me then the case study became, can an inner city home be built for the cost of an apartment? And this was the case study for Small House, and became the value proposition for the whole project, because it's the absolute reality of delivering any project how do you actually deliver it? How do you make it affordable? How do you not miss your budget? Here it is, that's the site, inner city context, next to transport. Don't really need a car, but it was a 2-car space site, so 6 by 7 metres. That's the empty site. You have to forego the front yard. You have to forego a street because you need to buy cheap land. It's in a lane or it's in a back alley. And that's the context we bought in. I mean, that's just reality. But you can then start to shift some of the cost into the physical construction. So the new typology in urban living is it's a refuge, building upwards, not outwards, assigning multiple uses, access to outdoor space via the roof, and working roof garden, no maintenance, affordable construction, and you're still creating a sense of community because you're engaging in the urban regeneration of that aspect of the city. That's covered up there, but you know, still have issues around noise, pollution, how does the building inhabit? All of those issues come to your head while you're designing a project. And you know, I think for personal projects, you could design for many years and just, you know, lose yourself in your solutions. But the typology was this sort of vertical layering. So the utility was at the base, sleeping was low down, and the views and the living spaces all opened up above the existing context. So living, dining, meals, and then the roof space. So we separated the levels, connected by a stair. I won't go into the plans, but you could see the sort of internal partitioning, the form, the bedroom, the open living, but again, that could be partitioned if someone wanted to, a kitchen and dining space. Some early studies, again, just testing the scale and testing the materiality, but they were all based on a fairly conventional line of construction, sort of context of scale, so you knew you could handle a certain scale because of the relationship of site. There were some clues on the site. That's the street wall, so you can see the sort of variegation of the street wall and how this becomes a new bookend to this end of the street. So this idea of buildability and again the eco-conscious spirit, the approval was there, GFA, 200 square metres, roof terrace, budget, $2.6 per square metre, but at the time the Sydney CBD were paying about $5,000 a square metre for decent resi, and really high quality precast was the only answer. I didn't realise it at the time, but when we actually did the costings for the cost of prelims in a conventional construction, I delivered the entire concrete package for the whole house. So it was a massive shift. It took, you know, $250,000 out of the budget and put it into the physical construction. So it's a pretty massive shift. The key was a crane, being able to physically fit it on site. So we actually brought the crane to the site before, and we had the most senior guys from Hanson testing whether the crane could literally physically lift. So these are some of the studies they did for the project, but I spent a lot of time with them trying to actually get the analysis right, and then I did some very rudimentary drawings, but we actually shop drew it with their structural engineer, and we took it to a point where every component of the house was prefabricated. So windows, floors, walls. So we cast the ground slab and we poured piles to support the building, but everything else was prefabricated, including this pod which had to sort of come in independently because the crane would get sort of jib bound. So the sort of rationality of the project became the sort of key narrative. So finding a very affordable line. You can't patternate the concrete, it's too expensive, so just a fine line became the expression, just a simple sort of dummy joint to create this kind of tile effect. These are the panels in the factory. These are the hollow core slabs that form the floors. I convinced them to cast in some provisions for lighting, so we incorporated some really nice lighting through the project. But again, it's just through, I guess, a bit of pressure. There's a very tiny project for Hanson to get involved with, but I think they had a relatively decent exposure at the end of it. This is some of the cast-in provisions, so they're all the stair panels being made. And again, just working with all the steelwork. The site, I think when I started, it looked really small. You know how when you're dealing on site and it sometimes compresses and expands? Well, this really compressed at this point. And I thought, God, it's not very big. But you stick to your guns, 6 by 7, it's actually really big. It's actually bigger than most typical living spaces in any apartment development. So you just have to stick to your guns. I think the builders were concerned. They drove around the site many times with the concrete truck because they couldn't find it, but they actually just kept driving around and around. So it's quite hilarious. And I said, no, you're there. Just to make sure, they just double checked before they started pouring. And then away we went. So these are just a sequence of assembly of the project. So see the panels going in, very simple. I mean, precast has been around for a long time. It just worked on this site. It literally just worked. And that was basically day one. So all the walls, all the slabs, all the hollow core. And then there was a sequence of lifting. So 4 days, we lifted the entire project. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then in alternate days, we poured the topping slabs that bound the slab to the hollow core. So it was pretty amazing to be able to get this up in 4 days. That's just, again, just some slides just to show the last sequence going up. So these are the last panels of the last level. That's the hollow core going in. Amazing group, Hanson, to just they delivered the vertical alignment within 10 millimeters, which I think's pretty damn good. And then the last sort of section going on, which was the sort of roof cap. So it was an interesting logistical project, as much that you can't just keep designing. You actually need to be working on the delivery model. And the delivery model becomes everything. And so it's a balance between, conceiving something and then what's actually executable. And I think working with the makers really starts to become a really important thing, because you just won't get there. That's just a large reframing of the view. And I think the rescale, these sort of massive windows, really gave a sense of openness. The stair, so you can just see the sort of cast in. That's where we brought the power, and that's where we cantilevered all the stairs off that wall. That again carried through the whole project. So materials handling, you've got a crane on site, just bring all the materials in one day, bring it in through the windows, and that's how we fitted out the interior. This just gives us a sort of screen grab from the grand designs, where you get a sense of the context that we built the house in. Really, really tight urban environment. And then just a sequence of the finished images of the house. I thought I'd share that because it was this presentation. Obviously, I didn't present it that way, but it won me the award. We were working out what we were going to have for dinner, and we're at the back, and we had this sort of Movida guide to Barcelona, and someone said, "I think you've won." And I said, "What?" And so it was pretty outstanding on that stage to get up there and take that award. And it does in many ways, even though it's the smallest project I've worked on. It is kind of, I guess, a culmination of a lot of thought and a lot of rationality and a lot of sort of, bringing things back to sort of, I guess, the essences of their project, finding the value within each project. The bathroom. So this was very much, it was about sort of flexibility of space. So there was big panel sliding walls that they slid over, or they opened, or they could pull back completely and reveal the bed space. It sort of came out from a relatively dark, it was an urban sanctuary, and then it opened up to the sort of living environments. And of course it was about bringing light. It faces northwest, so it's more westerly, so it gets a lot of late afternoon sun, which really, filtered straight in. The sort of the lighting integrated into the steps at the kitchen level, kitchen and dining. I'm glad my wife's not here. She'd be crying at the moment, because we've sold the house, and as of 3 o'clock tomorrow, we're no longer owners. So she's very emotional about it. But for me, it was just a project. I'm on to the next one already. Well, it's been in my head for 5 years anyway. So this is just. Oh, that's it. Okay. This is just how the view opened up. So it's quite an extraordinary house when you get a sense how the view really opens up as you move through, and how the light moves through the stairwell. all the way down, and this is just working your way up to the rooftop. Then the garden became really important. You know, it correlated back to the sort of the Italians and how they make the most of their terracing, and you know, they'll have a massive terrace, but they actually fill it completely with plants. So you can hardly even, you know, position a chair, and it's part of creating that sort of depth. And of course, you know, picking out the tree was always a key part of the sort of the ceremony of moving into this house. You know, I tried my hand at, you know, growing some tomatoes with Dad, and it didn't last very long. They all got eaten. I mean, you know, he spends so much time in that garden, but anyway, the idea was great. Chilies and things that are a bit more robust certainly made their way through. Very proud wife, and then I guess the finished garden products. So Daniel Baskey, again, is probably one of the smallest projects he's worked on, but we have a really good relationship to kind of, I guess, just work through with a lot of scribbles very quickly, and developed a sort of simple concept of pots and sort of rescaling and building a kind of instant sort of canopy effect with the plants and the trees. This is a rooftop study and the night view. And the last slide, that's kind of it.